Chapter 1. The Earl's Sons. In the bleak midwinter of the year 910, Odger Sveinsson plunged his sword through the chest of a young man from the clan of Fordensthorpe, Denmark. A petty war over Danish fields that had been raging for months was coming to an end. The clan of Earl Svein from Toltoft, Denmark, had officially claimed victory. Odger was walking the battlefield, checking for breathing warriors, ending their misery and sending them to Valhalla. As he bloodied his sword, he was sure to have mercy and allow the struggling warriors to hold their axes, spears, or swords to appease Odin as he stabbed their hearts. He found another man clinging to his final breaths, severely wounded from the bloody battle that ensued moments ago. Odger kicked a steel blade toward the man, and he weakly wrapped his red-stained fingers around the handle. Odger gazed upon the man. In a moment his life would be over, and he would no longer be a piece of the world as they know it. Perhaps the next one would be more forgiving than the one they have grown so accustomed to over the years. Had he made one bad move, or one mistake, it could have been him. The fierce young warrior glanced up at the view. It was a hilly battlefield with many Danish mountains poking their magnificent peaks into the skyline. He often gazed at the awesome view that the gods blessed his humble country with. Snow was beginning to flutter down from the vast, cloudy ether. The first of the year, winterfall, had begun. He fixed his eyes upon the man who was still anticipating a devastating blow, and again, Odger plunged his gory sword into another heart, with enough force to finish him. Odger killed many young men this day. A few came close to doing the same to him, but he was far too skilled to allow such a fate to befall him. His long orange braided and dreaded hair was stained with red, and his face had white war paint smudged across his eyes and forehead. His armor was bulky and covered his torso, but his broad tattooed shoulders and arms were bare. As he stepped over one dead body after another, he gazed upon the valley of dead warriors that were sent to the gods, and observed his men doing the same thing he was, ending lives. He noticed his brother, Rolak, finishing enemies with a battle axe. It seemed much more ruthless than to run a sword through their chest as Odger was. As he raised his weapon, many whimpers and cries were heard, a shameful death that Odin would not be pleased with. Rolak's victims would never see Valhalla's portals, and that pleased him. Rolak, at least let them hold their weapon for their last breath. Odin will remember how many honorable warriors we sent to him, he demanded. His brother paused with his battle axe raised high above his head and glanced at his older brother. He nodded disgruntledly, then kicked a dagger toward the injured enemy. The young warrior clutched the dagger desperately and braced for impact. As the axe soared down from the sky, a squelching crack could be heard from the other side of the mountains as the Fordensthorpe warrior's skull was blown apart by the brutal swing. To have mercy on another. It is the same as fretting about the fate that has been decided for them. Worry not, brother. Odin hand-picks his men regardless of your mercy. Rolak replied. His eyes were tinted with murderous savagery, and his face was splattered with blood. The battle was decisive. Only 20 Toltoft men were lost, while the entirety of the Fordensthorpe army was finally defeated. Odger examined the battlefield once again, and scanned for a trustworthy subordinate. Bragi, he called to one of his strongest warriors. Bragi came jogging over to Odger while he was wiping his battle axe with a cloth. Get all these dead men burned. We must avoid any illness befalling our clan. When you are finished with that, ride to Fordensthorpe with 20 men and gather their women and children. Burn the village down and kill the Earl's sons. Yes, my lord, Bragi answered. Odger knew the orders would take about 2 days to carry out. He whistled loudly to summon his mount, and mustered the rest of his army to ride back to Toltoft with Rolak. They were riding at a slow speed side by side. Rolak still had his axe in his hand, and had not yet cleaned it. It was dirtying his horse with gore. How do you know there are not more men in Fordensthorpe preparing for another attack? Will 20 men be enough? Rolak asked. 20 will be more than enough. Earl Vigo died in the battle. We've killed over 400 Fordensthorpe men in the past 3 full moons, This was his final stand. Odger answered. Toltoft was a small town, but it was populated. About 600 women and children, 100 slaves, and 500 men to call it home. The tall stone watchtower in the center of the houses that encircled it encapsulated the town and made it difficult to mistake it for another Viking tribe. When the army arrived, many of the men branched off to their respective homes, while Rolak and Odger trotted to the longhouse. Earl Svein, their father, was awaiting an update on his war. They entered the longhouse, both still covered in the enemy's bloodshed. As Rolak tracked drops of red sludge across the floorboards, he grimaced at the female slaves cleaning the tables. Svein was sitting on his throne while one of them washed his old, ugly feet. "I see neither of you are worthy of Odin's hall, yet," their father stated. Odger halted before the steps that led to the stage as Rolak poured himself a mug of ale. "We've emerged victorious. There will be many new women and children here in 2 days' time. We can enslave them, kill them, or allow them passage," said Odger. Svein nodded slowly with his lip protruded. "They will have the freedom to stay, or go. Half of them will be slaves, the ugly ones," he said. "I will have our newly claimed fields sowed at winter break. It should double our yield. We will need more silos. I will have the men begin preparations for building them tomorrow morning," Odger said. "Very well. Rolak, you seem to have enjoyed yourself. Does any of that blood come from your own wounds?" Svein asked. Rolak slammed an empty mug on the freshly cleaned tabletop and began pouring another until the pitcher was empty. "Give me ale, woman," Rolak bellowed loudly. One of the young slave girls scurried into the galley. "If you don't treat your women with respect, you may be fated to a cut throat during the midnight hours." Svein chuckled. The slave girl hurried over to Rolak with a full pitcher of ale. He snatched it out of her hand, spilling it on her blouse. Rolak began drinking aggressively from the pitcher, and most of it drenched him rather than washing down his gullet. He then snatched the girl's arm and began smelling her hair. She shrieked as he groped her without her consent. "Go to your room, Rolak," Odger ordered. Rolak paused his disgusting behavior and glared at his older brother. He wrenched the girl's arm and marched to his room with his hand cuffed tightly around her wrist, dragging her along unwillingly. "Be nice to her, Rolak," Svein warned. "I need a bath," he snapped at the Earl. Svein shook his head and rose from his throne. He raised his hand to order his slave to halt washing his feet. He walked slowly toward Odger. "You are my heir, but he is still my son. He will be your responsibility soon, Odger," Svein whispered. Odger knew this. It was clear that his father had never put the effort needed into raising Rolak, the same way he had raised him. The way he understood it, Rolak had already been Odger's responsibility for many years. "I am getting old and sick. Your time is approaching faster than you might think, my son," Svein said in a low tone. He sauntered with a hunched back to the pitcher Rolak left behind. He began to pour himself what was left. Odger stood tall at 6 feet and 4 inches. He rested his hand on his sword. At 24 years of age, he adapted well to his role as the heir to the throne of Toltoft. Rolak, being only 19, was still quite immature. He was forever bitter about the preferred treatment Odger received from their father. Though it was not because of a lack of trying, Svein had attempted to assign Rolak more responsibility in governing the clan the same way he had with Odger. But he was much less receptive of such a role. As a result, Svein did not continue to invest in teaching Rolak to lead. Since the sudden death of their mother 4 years prior, Rolak has been nothing more than a common barbarian with royal blood. The loss of the queen reverberated throughout the entire clan, but the pain stuck with nobody more intensely than her youngest son. "You have proved more than worthy of my throne, Odger. I believe you will honor our bloodline with glory and conquest. As I come toward the end of my reign, I look back and feel proud of my feats. Though I have not managed to grow the clan as much as I would have liked, I feel satisfied with how well I've managed to keep it all together. As you well know, I've won many battles, killed many warriors, and survived many plagues. I honored my father's dynasty the same way you will honor yours. But I worry for you, Odger. I fear you are not passionate enough. You are not merciless. You are by far the finest warrior I've ever seen swing a sword. But you swing it with grace, not violence. You lack the thirst for blood I've seen in many before you. And I fear this will be your demise, my son. You must cut their throat with fury and hatred, or one day your enemies might catch you by surprise. Odger bowed his head and closed his eyes. He said nothing. It was not the first time Svein gave him this lecture, and it would likely not be the last. Odger was unsure what more he could do. He had killed hundreds of men since his 14th year of age. He still remembers the first. Over a decade ago was Odger's first battle. A clan from the east was dedicated to the eradication of Toltoft and Earl Svein. Odger would never be able to recall the name of the clan, or the earl that led the aggressors. He was too young to understand the politics of war. He dismounted his horse and held an axe in his hand, as he watched all the men in the shield wall clanging steel with homicidal intentions. The violent, brutal passion behind each swing of the sword, blow of an axe, pierce of a spear. It was almost too much for Odger. Svein was still atop his horse. He smirked as he was certain that the battle was already won. Then, randomly, a scrawny, incapable warrior had found a way to sneak behind the Toltoft shield wall. He was running toward Svein, and young Odger was the first to notice. As the skinny warrior sprinted with bloodthirsty intent, Odger raised his axe to defend his father. He postured defensively, as he was trained, and prepared to fight a true battle to the death for the first time. The warrior noticed Odger and dashed toward him. When he arrived at striking distance, he wildly swung his axe in a downward motion, but Odger saw the uncontrolled technique. He dodged the blow, and as he repositioned behind the warrior, he managed to cut his knee open with a slight upward thrust. The warrior dropped his weapon and keeled over on the floor in pain, while clenching his knee. Odger looked up at his father, who was spectating from his horse. Svein glared at his young son and nodded, as if to encourage him to finish the kill. Odger stepped toward the warrior and kicked his axe to him, as soon as the enemy lunged for his weapon to make one last defensive attempt. Odger had already made a perfectly smooth swing with his battle axe that cut the man's neck just enough to nick his jugular. Odger looked down at the man and watched him bleed profusely. He didn't feel guilty, but it also did not feel natural. It felt like he had done something horribly wrong. He was compelled to believe he had committed a crime against humanity. As he attempted to reject any kind of empathy that resided in his heart, he watched the soul of the fighter slip away from his eyes. Odger noticed the man let his weapon fall out of his grasp. He knelt, and then reached to place it back in his hand. "Go to Odin, and tell him you fought with all you had to offer. I will see you in Valhalla," Odger whispered as he punctured the man's chest with the sharp edge of his axe. Earl Svein watched with a curious expression. His son never failed to surprise him. The compassion that was instilled in his heart was never something he taught. It was not a quality he had or understood. In the Earl's mind, the enemy was a force to be crushed, a group of non-humans, an army of unworthy opposing adversaries. The Earl sipped his mug while leaning on a chair in the middle of the longhouse. Odger stopped thinking about the past and remembered he should address his father. "I do not mean to disappoint you, father," Odger said with a hint of sarcasm. Svein nodded slowly. He stepped away and limped toward his room. "You haven't... I just don't understand you. But I do believe in you. Send a few women to my bed. You'd do well to take some for yourself and wash the enemy off your face," Svein said without looking back. As he walked away, he unhealthily retched a handful of mucus into his palm and then tossed it to the floor. Odger did not move. He stood tall and straight with a firm posture in the middle of the large room and studied the throne he would one day sit upon. He folded his hands in front of him and thought for a moment. He was unsure what kind of ruler he could or would be. Will he be merciless or graceful? Will he have an iron fist or a helping hand? only a few of the many thoughts he had been pondering upon for years. Two days passed, and many young children and women were being herded into the center of the town around the tall stone watchtower that the clan referred to as Tolska. The crowd of newcomers were devastated, crying and wailing over their husband's demise and their village burned to the ground. They had heard tales of what happens to the widowed women of war. They anxiously awaited their fate as they gathered in a large group around Tolska. Odgur was supervising the construction of a new silo 50 paces away from Tolska. He had his hands resting on the hilt of his blade like usual. He examined the depressing sight of all the precious women and children scared for their lives. He knew what was about to happen to them. He wanted to ease their anxiety, but he thought against it, as he did not want to seem defiant in his father's eyes. Earl Svein emerged from the longhouse and limped toward the crowd of immigrants. He leaned on his trusted spear with each step to ease the pain in his aged legs. When he arrived close enough to them, he clambered to the top of a boulder with the help of a Viking warrior. He cleared his throat and began a speech. Welcome to Toltoft, women and children of Fordensthorpe. As a result of the recent conclusion of the battle between our clans, we have now begun a merger of sorts. With the sudden growth in the population of Toltoft, half of you will now live the necessary and humble life of a slave. Svein paused for a moment to cough violently, the way old men do. The other half, well, there are many men without wives here. Some of you may have to be taken as second wives. It would be in your best interest to be flexible in your preferences. Fear not. Whether you are enslaved or free, your children will be cared for. It is not your fault that your Earl picked a war he could not win. As for the half of you that are not enslaved, you will have the freedom to leave, or stay. Keep in mind that the nearest village is about 4 days' travel by horse and 10 days on foot. Wolves are hungry during winterfall, as I'm sure you are aware. You will not be provided with horses, I should mention. Odgur and Rolak will now pick out those of you who will serve Toltoft. Once they are done, the remainder of you will find a place to stay. I am sure you are all cold and hungry from your long journey. You will all be blessed with the hospitality of Toltoft. Boys, begin. At the end of Earl Svein's welcoming speech, the women and children seemed a bit less frightened. There are horrible tales of clans that simply buried, burned alive, slaughtered, even drowned the women and children of a collapsed town. They feared the worst, but what they were facing was far from such demise. Odgur and Rolak began wading their way through a sea of 300 women and children. Odgur was grouping all the children into one place while Rolak was judging the beauty of each woman. The children were herded into the longhouse with the slaves, and the remainder of the pretty women were left standing in front of Tolska. Earl Svein hobbled off the boulder and made his way into the longhouse to assign the new slaves their orders and arrange accommodations for the young children he was officially responsible for. Rolak followed the crowd into the longhouse, and Odgur was left outside with the last of them. About 100 free women stood in front of him with relief beset upon their faces. As my father explained, you are free women. You may stay, or you may go. Keep in mind that if you decide to leave, your children will not be going with you. We cannot afford to provide any horses for you, since your men slaughtered dozens of them during the war. You have options. You can decide for yourself that you'd rather be a slave. You can find yourself a new husband. You can begin your journey to the next village. Or you can stand here in the cold and keel over and die. Which one you choose, I don't care. I live in the longhouse, but I will mention that I have built a small hut on the east side of town that I can provide to 3 women. If you are interested, you will follow me. The rest of you, choose carefully. Odgur began to march away, with several beautiful women following behind him. The rest of the crowd scattered around. Several foolishly began their journey to the next town. A few chose to be slaves, and many began conversing with various young men in the village. I said 3. Some of you will have to go elsewhere, he said, annoyed. The women looked at each other awkwardly, and many of them concernedly walked away in an aimless manner. Once there were 3 stubborn ones remaining, he turned and gestured them to follow. Odger opened the door to his hut and immediately began to spark a flame in the fireplace. The small hut had 2 beds, a table, and some chests for storage. The 3 women sat down and began asking Odger many questions. When can we see our children again? Have you seen my husband since the final battle? Is there anything for us to eat or drink? Are you in search of a wife? Odger did not answer any of their questions. He stayed quiet. He simply tended to the fire and attempted to provide some warmth for them. He opened the chest and retrieved a loaf of bread and a water skin. He placed it on the table and began to generously cut pieces off for them. He handed each of them a piece, and they immediately inhaled it. The women were surprised with Odger's hospitality. He was providing much more than they expected. Odger finished slicing the bread and allowed them to help themselves to the rest. He then began to pull a large cast-iron bucket down from the ceiling framework in the hut and left with it. A few moments later, he returned with it full of water, and he placed it near the fire propped up on 2 stones. You can bathe each other in this. I would wait some time to allow the water to warm. I will give you privacy. I have things to do, but I will return later with more food and water for you. Do whatever you'd like, but should you choose to leave, tell me first, Odger said. The women blushed with appreciation. They were incredibly grateful for Odger's gentle reception. Odger was not acting under any ulterior motives. He had no wife, but he also was not in search of one. He felt guilty for being directly responsible for the situation these women were in, so the least he could do was provide what he had for them. Rolak and Earl Svein were feeding the new slaves and giving each of them orders, assigning the long-serving slaves of Toltoft to train them. Odger arrived in the longhouse and observed Rolak screaming in the face of one of the women. He watched unamused. Rolak was large and intimidating. He stood at 6 feet and 7 inches. His shoulders were extremely broad, and his hair was long, unkempt and brown. He may have weighed close to half that of a horse. He was walking around scaring the women, breaking them in and getting them accustomed to his violent nature. Odger approached him and glared at him with a cold, distant gaze. What? Rolak asked. Give them some rest, Rolak. You've killed off all their husbands. They've had a rough couple of days. Go check on the construction of the silos and ensure the builders aren't doing anything foolish, Odger ordered. Rolak sighed and then shoulder-checked Odger on his way out of the longhouse. Odger rolled his eyes annoyed and then walked toward Svein, who was sitting on his throne. All the women are accounted for. Some are searching for husbands in the village. It will stir up discontent among the women already in Toltoft, considering most of the men have wives already. There will be women who cannot find a home. What do you suggest we do with them? Odger asked. Earl Svein stroked his beard as he sat up straight in his throne. He looked at his son with an inquisitive expression, as he often did. The things that cross that mind of yours are so interesting to me, Odger. Who cares? It will sort itself out eventually. It is the middle of the winter, father. They will die, Odger stated factually. Svein shrugged. He did not care. In his eyes, he had already shown the women and children a kindness that was unheard of in Danish culture. Take care of it then, Svein said. Odger left the longhouse. He visited the construction site of the silo and saw Rolak barking orders at the builders. You 4, you're coming with me to build a new house, Odger ordered while pointing at a random group of men. What are you doing, Odger? If you divide the builders, it will take an extra day to build this fucking thing, Rolak spat. We are not on a strict time schedule. There will be 4 new silos before winter break. We cannot fill them until then anyway, Odger responded. Why are you building a damn house, Odger? You already have one, and a room in the longhouse, Rolak asked. Odger did not answer. He led the builders over to an area on the other side of the village and began helping them push snow out of the way, so a foundation could be dug from the earth. By nightfall, the clan began to settle down. Snow was fluttering from the sky as Odger gazed at the stars. He was wearing a large cloak with wolfskin over his shoulders. He was by the training dummy outside the hut. He had been striking it with a practice sword for some time, and was taking a break to ponder on his thoughts. He trained here often, to get away from all the noise and retreat to his reflections, usually as a nightly routine. As he was admiring the sky, letting the snowflakes land on his face and beard, he noticed a person approaching him, but he did not acknowledge them. He could sense it was a woman. She was wearing a hooded cloak to keep warm. "Odger, is it?" she asked in a soft tone. "Yes," he replied without turning to her. "I apologize, my lord. I'm staying in your hut, and I just had to ask you if you were still bringing us supper tonight," she questioned in an embarrassed, delicate voice. Odger lowered his head and sheathed the dull sword. He had forgotten about them after all he was doing throughout the day. "Yes, I will be there within the hour," he answered. "Thank you, my lord, for everything. I have never met a warrior with a heart as kind as yours," she said to him, and then turned to run back into the hut. Odger entered the hut with a sack full of cooked mutton, bread, and dried fruit. He also had ale and water. He placed it on the table, and the three women gathered around to receive their share. Odger sat on the bed and placed his head into his hands. He had not eaten all day either. He was exhausted from working all day in the village, attempting to construct a house and a silo, and ordering new people around the village. It demanded a lot of energy. The girls each had a bit of food in their hands, and they were all gawking at Odger like he was a mythical creature. It took him a moment to notice. Then he looked at them and paused. "Is it good enough?" he asked. They all looked at each other. He was truly unlike anyone they had ever met. "It is plenty enough, my lord," said one of the women. "Are you not the son of the Earl?" asked one of the other women. "I am the heir," he answered. They all looked at each other in surprise. "Why are you being so kind to us?" Odger shifted and decided to lay down on one of the beds for a moment. "When grain sprouts from a field, do you ask it why it has done so? Or do you simply harvest it and enjoy it for what it has to offer?" he answered. And then he closed his eyes and fell into a deep slumber.
At the edge of dreamy dusk, where night devours the day. A tapestry of twilight stars stitched in the evening sky. Lanterns flicker on the path as ghosts of moments fly, walking slow with heavy thoughts through twilight's hazy mist. Echoes of forgotten tales in the gentle evening's twist. Dreamy dust, take me home, where the sea meets the shore. In your arms I'll find my peace, hear your whispers once more. Dreamy dust, guide my way through the veil of the night, bathe me